The morning sun cast long shadows across the training ground as Sarah Martinez adjusted her rifle scope for the 100th time. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cool desert air, but from the weight of dozens of eyes watching her every move. The other soldiers in her unit had made their opinions clear over the past 6 months. Women didn't belong in combat roles. Women couldn't handle the pressure. Women would crack when lives depended on their skills. Sarah had heard it all before, whispered in mess halls and shouted during heated training exercises. She had joined the military with dreams of serving her country with honor, following in the footsteps of her grandfather, who had been a decorated marksman in World War II. But reality had proven far more challenging than her idealistic vision. Every day brought new tests, new doubts, and new voices telling her she didn't belong. The training sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Thompson with scars running down his left cheek, called out across the range, "Martinez, you're up for long-distance qualification. Hit the target at 800 yards, 3 shots, standard military conditions." His voice carried no emotion. But Sarah knew he was one of the few who believed she might actually succeed. Most of the others were probably betting on her failure. Sarah positioned herself behind the rifle, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon against her shoulder. The target seemed impossibly small at this distance. Just a tiny speck of white against the brown hillside. She had practiced this shot hundreds of times, but never with so many people watching, never with so much riding on her performance. Her breathing exercises kicked in automatically, the techniques her grandfather had taught her during countless hunting trips in the mountains of Colorado. The first shot rang out across the desert. Sarah held her breath as the spotter called out the result. "Miss. 2 inches low and 3 inches right." A few snickers came from behind her, quickly silenced by Thompson's sharp look. Sarah made the mental calculations, adjusted her aim, and prepared for the second shot. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. But her hands had steadied. The second shot was closer. 1 inch high, dead center for windage, the spotter announced. Sarah could feel the tension in the air shift slightly. Maybe she wasn't going to embarrass herself completely. She took several deep breaths, visualizing the perfect shot in her mind. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, telling her to trust her training, trust her instincts, and never let doubt creep into her mind. The third shot felt perfect the moment she pulled the trigger. The rifle's recoil felt clean, and she knew before the spotter called it out. Direct hit, center mass. A few surprised murmurs came from the watching soldiers, but most remained silent. Sarah had qualified, but barely. It was good enough to pass, but not good enough to silence the critics. Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into training with renewed determination. She spent extra hours on the range, working on her technique in all weather conditions. Rain, wind, extreme heat, and bitter cold. She practiced in everything the desert could throw at her. Her accuracy improved steadily, but the whispers continued. She was good in training, they said, but combat was different. Combat would break her. The doubt began to creep into her own mind during night training exercises. When explosions went off around her, and instructors shouted conflicting orders, her usually steady hands would shake. During one particularly intense drill simulating enemy contact, she completely missed a target at 200 yards, a shot she could make blindfolded under normal circumstances. The failure haunted her for days. Lieutenant Colonel James Reeves, the battalion commander, called her into his office one afternoon. Sarah expected another lecture about living up to expectations, or perhaps news that she was being transferred to a non-combat role. Instead, Reeves surprised her with a different conversation. "Martinez, I've been watching your progress, and I want to be straight with you," Reeves said, his weathered face serious but not unkind. "You have natural talent with a rifle that I've rarely seen. But talent isn't enough in combat. The question isn't whether you can hit a target when everything is calm. The question is whether you can make the shot when everything is falling apart around you." Sarah nodded, unsure how to respond. She had been asking herself the same question every day. "I'm not going to tell you that gender doesn't matter out here," Reeves continued. "It does. Because people think it does. You're going to face prejudice and doubt that your male counterparts never will. But I've seen enough combat to know that when the shooting starts, the only thing that matters is whether you can do your job. Everything else is just noise. The conversation stayed with Sarah as her unit prepared for deployment to a volatile region where insurgent activity had been increasing. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces were becoming bolder, launching attacks on supply convoys and remote outposts. Sarah's unit would be part of a larger operation to establish security in the region and protect vital supply routes. 2 weeks before deployment, Sarah's accuracy scores had improved dramatically. She was consistently hitting targets at ranges that impressed even the veteran snipers in the unit, but the stress tests continued to be her weakness. During simulated combat exercises, her performance would drop significantly when under pressure. The other soldiers noticed, and the whispers grew louder. Private Jenkins, a cocky young man from Texas who had made no secret of his belief that women didn't belong in combat, made his opinion known during a training break. "Martinez might be able to hit a paper target when it's quiet," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "but wait until bullets start flying her way. She'll probably drop her rifle and run." Several other soldiers laughed, but Thompson shut them down quickly. "Jenkins, you worry about your own performance. Martinez has earned her place here just like everyone else." But Sarah could see the doubt in Thompson's eyes too. Everyone was wondering the same thing. Would she hold up when it really mattered? The night before deployment, Sarah sat alone in her barracks, cleaning her rifle for the final time on American soil. The weapon had become an extension of herself over the months of training, and she knew every scratch and worn spot on its surface. She thought about her grandfather, who had passed away just before she enlisted. He had always believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her younger sister back home. "Saw the news about your deployment on Facebook. Dad's worried but proud. Grandpa would be proud too. Come home safe, sharpshooter." Sarah smiled despite her nerves. Her family's support meant everything, even if they had no idea about the challenges she was facing with her unit. The transport plane was massive and loud, filled with soldiers from multiple units heading to the same region. Sarah found herself seated next to a veteran sergeant named Rodriguez, who had deployed 3 times before. He had been one of the few soldiers who had never questioned her presence in the unit, judging her only on her performance. "First deployment?" Rodriguez asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes, Sergeant. Nervous but ready," Sarah replied honestly. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Fear is normal. Anyone who tells you they're not scared is either lying or stupid. The key is not letting fear control you. Use it to stay sharp, stay alive." He paused for a moment, then added, "I've seen your scores on the range. You've got good instincts. Trust them when the time comes." The conversation helped calm some of Sarah's nerves, but she knew the real test was still ahead. As the plane flew through the night toward an uncertain future, she closed her eyes and tried to prepare mentally for whatever was waiting for them in the desert on the other side of the world. The landing was rough, and the heat hit them immediately as they stepped off the plane. The forward operating base was a collection of temporary buildings surrounded by high walls and guard towers. Everything was brown: the buildings, the ground, even the air seemed tinted with dust. Sarah shouldered her gear and followed her unit toward their assigned quarters, trying to take in everything around her while staying alert. Their first week at the base was spent on patrol duties and familiarization with the local area. Sarah quickly learned that the desert here was different from the training grounds back home. The heat was more intense, the dust got into everything, and the constant awareness that enemies might be watching from any direction created a tension that never went away. During their 3rd patrol, Sarah got her first real taste of the stress she would face in combat. Their convoy was moving through a narrow valley when the lead vehicle reported possible enemy movement on the ridgeline above them. Sarah was positioned as overwatch in the 2nd vehicle, scanning the hills through her rifle scope for any signs of threat. Her heart rate immediately spiked as she searched for targets among the rocks and scrub brush. Every shadow looked like a potential enemy position. Every movement of vegetation in the wind could be someone taking aim at their convoy. The radio chattered with reports and orders, and Sarah found her hands starting to shake slightly as she tried to maintain focus through her scope. Nothing came of that patrol. The movement turned out to be wild goats. But Sarah realized how different it felt to be looking for real enemies who might shoot back. The paper targets on the training range had never made her palms sweat or her breathing become shallow. She began to understand what everyone meant about performing under pressure. As the days passed, Sarah's unit settled into a routine of patrols, guard duty, and maintenance work. The base had a small shooting range where soldiers could practice, and Sarah spent her free time there, working constantly to improve her skills. She knew that everyone was still watching her, still waiting to see if she would measure up when it really mattered. The opportunity to prove herself would come sooner than anyone expected. The alarm shattered the pre-dawn quiet at 0430 hours, sending soldiers scrambling from their bunks. Sarah's eyes snapped open immediately, her training kicking in before she was fully awake. The urgent tone of the base-wide announcement told her this wasn't a drill. She grabbed her gear and rushed toward the briefing room, her heart already racing with adrenaline. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves stood at the front of the packed room, his face grim in the harsh fluorescent lighting. A large map of the region covered the wall behind him, with red markers indicating areas of enemy activity. Sarah found a spot near the back with the other members of her squad, noting the tense atmosphere that filled the room. At 0200 hours, Bravo Company was ambushed during a routine supply run approximately 15 miles northeast of our position. Reeves began, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. They're pinned down in a valley with limited cover, taking heavy fire from elevated positions. Communications are sporadic, but we know they have wounded and are running low on ammunition. The room remained silent as Reeves continued the briefing. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she realized this was real combat, not another training exercise. Somewhere out in the desert, American soldiers were fighting for their lives, and her unit was being called upon to help them. Intelligence suggests the enemy force consists of approximately 30 to 40 insurgents armed with automatic weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, and at least one heavy machine gun. They've positioned themselves on the high ground overlooking the valley, giving them significant tactical advantage. Reeves pointed to the map, showing the terrain that Bravo Company was trapped in. Sarah studied the map carefully, noting the distances involved and the elevation changes. The valley was roughly 3 miles long and surrounded by hills that rose several hundred feet above the floor. It was perfect terrain for an ambush, with multiple escape routes for the attackers and limited options for the defenders. Alpha Company will approach from the south and attempt to flank the enemy positions, Reeves continued. Charlie Company will provide direct assault support. Delta Company will establish a blocking position to prevent enemy escape to the north. He paused and looked directly at Sarah's unit. Echo Company will provide overwatch and precision fire support from the western ridge. Sarah's pulse quickened. Overwatch meant her skills as a marksman would be critical to the mission's success. She would be responsible for identifying and eliminating high-priority targets at long range, potentially making the difference between success and failure for the entire operation. The briefing continued with details about radio frequencies, medical evacuation procedures, and rules of engagement. Sarah absorbed every piece of information while trying to calm her nerves. She had trained for this moment for months, but the reality of knowing that people's lives would depend on her accuracy was overwhelming. After the briefing, Sarah's squad leader, Staff Sergeant Martinez, no relation despite the shared surname, pulled her aside for a private conversation. Martinez was a veteran of multiple deployments and had gradually become one of Sarah's strongest supporters as her skills improved during training. Martinez, I know you're probably feeling the pressure right now, he said quietly. This is going to be different from anything you've experienced in training, but I want you to know that I have complete confidence in your abilities. You've earned your place on this team, and today you're going to prove it to everyone. Sarah nodded, grateful for the encouragement but still feeling the weight of expectation. I understand. Sergeant, I'm ready. Good. Remember your training, trust your instincts, and don't let anyone else's doubts get inside your head. You've got this. Martinez's words helped steady her nerves somewhat, but Sarah knew that the real test was still ahead. The convoy departed the base 30 minutes later, a line of armored vehicles moving through the desert as the sun began to rise on the horizon. Sarah sat in the back of her assigned vehicle, checking and rechecking her equipment. Her rifle was clean and properly zeroed, her scope was clear, and she had enough ammunition for an extended engagement. Everything was ready except her nerves. As they drove toward the combat zone, Sarah could hear radio communications from the trapped company becoming increasingly desperate. Reports of casualties were coming in regularly, and it was clear that Bravo Company couldn't hold out much longer without support. The urgency of the situation helped focus her mind on the mission rather than her own fears. The convoy reached their deployment position after 40 minutes of driving across rough desert terrain. Sarah's unit would have to climb approximately 800 feet up a rocky hillside to reach their overwatch position, carrying all their equipment with them. The climb would be exhausting in the desert heat, but it would give them a commanding view of the entire valley where the battle was taking place. Sarah shouldered her pack and began the ascent with the rest of her team. The weight of her equipment seemed heavier than usual, and the combination of adrenaline and physical exertion made her breathing labored. Sweat began pouring down her face within minutes, and she had to fight the urge to drink too much water from her canteen. Halfway up the hillside, the sound of distant gunfire became clearly audible. The rapid chatter of automatic weapons mixed with the deeper boom of explosions created a constant background noise that reminded everyone that this wasn't an exercise. Real people were fighting and dying just a few miles away, and time was running out. The climb took nearly 2 hours, with several breaks to rest and hydrate. By the time they reached the designated overwatch position, Sarah was exhausted but alert. The view from their elevated position was spectacular and terrifying at the same time. The entire valley stretched out below them, and she could see the smoke and dust clouds, marking the location of the ongoing battle. Through her rifle scope, Sarah could make out the vehicles of Bravo Company clustered in a defensive position near the center of the valley. Muzzle flashes from enemy positions on the opposite hillside were visible even in the bright morning sunlight. The tactical situation was exactly as described in the briefing. Bravo Company was trapped with no way out and limited cover from enemy fire. Staff Sergeant Martinez set up the team's communication equipment and began coordinating with the other units involved in the rescue operation. Sarah positioned herself behind her rifle and began scanning the enemy-held ridgeline, looking for targets and trying to assess the tactical situation. The distance from her position to the enemy-held hills was significant, approximately 2.5 miles at the closest point, extending to over 3 miles for some of the enemy positions. These were extremely long-range shots that would challenge even the most experienced marksman. Sarah had practiced at these distances before, but never in combat conditions with lives hanging in the balance. As she watched through her scope, Sarah could see enemy fighters moving between positions on the far hillside. They appeared to be well-organized and disciplined, using the terrain effectively to maintain their advantage over the trapped convoy. Several heavy weapons positions were clearly visible, including what appeared to be a mortar team that was dropping rounds dangerously close to the surrounded American forces. The radio crackled with urgent communications as the other elements of the rescue force moved into position. Alpha Company was still an hour away from their flanking position, and Charlie Company was encountering heavy resistance as they attempted their direct assault. Time was running out for Bravo Company, and Sarah realized that her unit might be the only hope for breaking the enemy's hold on the high ground. "Martinez, we need you to start engaging targets of opportunity," came the order over the radio from Lieutenant Colonel Reeves. "Priority targets are heavy weapons positions and anyone directing enemy fire. You have authorization to engage immediately." Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she realized the moment had finally arrived. This was what all her training had been building toward, the chance to prove that she belonged in combat and could perform when lives depended on her skills. She took several deep breaths and began scanning for her first target. Through her scope, she could see an enemy fighter positioned behind a heavy machine gun that was raking the trapped convoy with sustained fire. The range was approximately 2,800 yards, requiring precise calculations for wind, elevation, and bullet drop. Sarah made the mental adjustments and settled into her shooting position. The first shot was crucial. A miss would alert the enemy to her position and potentially draw fire toward her Overwatch team, but a successful hit would eliminate a major threat to the trapped soldiers and demonstrate that the rescue force had the capability to strike back at long range. Sarah controlled her breathing and waited for the natural pause between heartbeats. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her to trust her training and not overthink the shot. She squeezed the trigger smoothly, feeling the familiar recoil of her rifle as the bullet left the barrel. The bullet's flight time at that range was nearly 4 seconds, an eternity in combat. Sarah held her position and watched through her scope as the enemy machine gunner suddenly pitched backward and disappeared from view. The heavy machine gun fell silent immediately. "Confirmed hit on heavy machine gun position," reported the spotter working with Sarah's team. The radio immediately came alive with excited chatter as other units realized that the enemy's advantage was beginning to erode. Sarah didn't have time to celebrate. Enemy fighters were already moving to replace the fallen machine gunner, and other targets were presenting themselves across the ridgeline. She quickly identified a group of insurgents who appeared to be directing fire from other positions, likely squad leaders or commanders coordinating the ambush. The second shot was even more challenging. The target was partially concealed behind rocks and moving periodically to observe different sectors of the valley. Sarah had to time her shot perfectly, waiting for the moment when the enemy fighter exposed himself enough to present a clear target. When the opportunity came, Sarah was ready. Her second shot struck the target center mass, eliminating another key figure in the enemy's command structure. The effect was immediately visible as confusion began to spread among the insurgent positions. Without clear leadership, their coordinated fire began to break down. Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah engaged 6 more targets at ranges varying from 2,600 to 3,100 yards. Each shot required precise calculations and perfect timing, and each successful hit further degraded the enemy's ability to maintain their ambush. The trapped convoy below began to show signs of renewed hope as the incoming fire decreased significantly. The other elements of the rescue force were making progress as well. Alpha Company had reached their flanking position and was beginning to engage enemy positions from the south. Charlie Company's direct assault was meeting less resistance as the insurgents found themselves under attack from multiple directions. The radio suddenly erupted with panicked voices as the situation on the ground took a dramatic turn for the worse. Sarah listened with growing alarm as reports came in from multiple units. The enemy had apparently held a significant force in reserve, and fresh fighters were now pouring into the valley from hidden positions, threatening to overrun the trapped convoy before the rescue forces could reach them. All units. All units. "This is Bravo 6, came the desperate voice of the trapped company commander. "We have enemy reinforcements moving on our position from the north. At least 50 fighters with heavy weapons. We cannot hold this position much longer. Request immediate support. Over." Sarah's spotter, Corporal Davies, lowered his binoculars with a grim expression. "Martinez. I can see them moving down the northern slope. They're going to hit Bravo Company from the blind side, where they have no cover at all. If those fighters reach the valley floor, it's going to be a massacre." Through her rifle scope, Sarah could see the new threat developing. A large group of enemy fighters was indeed moving rapidly down the hillside toward the trapped convoy. They were still approximately 2 miles away from the American position, but they were moving fast and would reach effective weapons range within minutes. The tactical situation was becoming desperate. Alpha Company was still 15 minutes away from being able to provide flanking support. Charlie Company was engaged in a fierce firefight and couldn't break contact to redirect their assault. The responsibility for stopping this new threat fell squarely on Sarah's shoulders. "Martinez, we need you to slow down that advancing force," came the urgent order from Staff Sergeant Martinez over the radio. "You're our only asset in position to engage them before they reach the convoy. Take whatever shots you can." Sarah swung her rifle toward the new targets, immediately realizing the complexity of the challenge she was facing. The enemy fighters were moving in a loose formation down a steep hillside, using whatever cover they could find. They weren't standing still like targets on a training range. They were combat veterans who knew how to move under fire. The range was approximately 3,200 yards to the closest targets, with some of the enemy force scattered across a front that extended the distance to nearly 3,500 yards. These were among the longest shots Sarah had ever attempted, made more difficult by the fact that the targets were moving and the desert heat was creating significant atmospheric distortion. Sarah's first shot at the advancing force missed cleanly, the bullet striking the rocky hillside several feet behind her intended target. The miss wasn't entirely unexpected given the extreme range and difficult conditions, but Sarah knew she couldn't afford many more failures. Time was running out for the trapped soldiers below. Corporal Davies was calling out wind speed and direction, while also tracking the movement of the enemy formation. Wind is 8 to 10 miles per hour from the southwest. They're moving in bounds, taking cover behind rocks and brush. Lead the moving targets by approximately 6 feet at this range. Sarah made the mental adjustments and selected a new target. An enemy fighter, who appeared to be carrying a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. Eliminating the RPG gunner would prevent the enemy from using the weapon against the vulnerable vehicles in the valley below. Her second shot was much closer, missing the target by less than 2 feet. The bullet struck the rock face near the enemy fighter's position, sending fragments flying and causing him to dive for cover. While not a direct hit, the near miss had the effect of slowing the enemy advance, as fighters became aware they were under accurate sniper fire. The psychological impact of long-range precision fire was something Sarah had studied but never experienced in practice. Enemy fighters who had been moving aggressively down the hillside suddenly became much more cautious, taking longer to move between covered positions and spending more time scanning for threats. Sarah's third shot found its mark. The RPG gunner, who had been her target, suddenly collapsed and tumbled down the rocky slope, his weapon clattering away among the stones. The successful hit sent a visible wave of concern through the enemy formation as they realized that nowhere on the hillside was truly safe from the unseen marksman. Confirmed kill on RPG gunner, Davies reported over the radio. Enemy advance is slowing significantly. They're taking cover and moving much more cautiously now. The temporary pause in the enemy advance bought precious time for the rescue forces. But Sarah knew it wouldn't last long. The enemy commanders would soon reorganize their fighters and resume the assault, possibly splitting their force to make targeting more difficult. She needed to maximize the impact of every shot while the opportunity existed. Sarah's next target was a figure who appeared to be directing the movement of other fighters, likely a squad leader or section commander. The individual was positioned behind a large boulder approximately 3,400 yards away, occasionally exposing himself to gesture directions to his subordinates. The shot required perfect timing. Sarah had to wait for the moment when the target exposed enough of himself to present a viable aiming point, while also accounting for the significant bullet drop and wind drift at that extreme range. When the opportunity came, she was ready. The bullet's flight time at that distance was nearly 5 seconds. Sarah held her breath and watched through her scope as the enemy commander suddenly pitched forward and disappeared behind the boulder. The immediate effect on the fighters under his command was dramatic. Without clear leadership, their coordinated movement began to break down into confused small group actions. Over the next several minutes, Sarah engaged 4 more targets among the advancing force. Not every shot was successful, but each engagement had the cumulative effect of disrupting the enemy's assault and buying time for the rescue forces to reach their positions. The radio chattered constantly with updates from all elements of the operation. Alpha Company was finally in position and beginning their flanking attack. Charlie Company had broken through the enemy's forward positions and was advancing toward the trapped convoy. The tide of the battle was beginning to turn, but the situation remained critical. Bravo 6. This is Alpha 6, came a new voice over the radio. We are engaging enemy positions from the south. Estimate we can reach your position in 10 minutes. Can you hold until then? Alpha 6. This is Bravo 6, replied the trapped company commander. We'll hold as long as we can, but we're taking casualties and running low on ammunition. The sniper fire from Overwatch has been keeping the northern assault force at bay, but they're still moving on our position. Sarah realized that the next few minutes would be the most critical of the entire engagement. The enemy force advancing from the north had been slowed but not stopped, and they were still moving toward the trapped convoy. If they reached effective weapons range before Alpha Company could provide relief, the outcome would be disastrous. Through her scope, Sarah could see that the enemy fighters had adapted to the threat of long-range sniper fire by moving in smaller groups and using available cover more effectively. They were still advancing, but their progress was much slower and more cautious than before. The psychological pressure on Sarah was enormous. She knew that hundreds of soldiers were depending on her ability to continue disrupting the enemy advance. Every shot she took could potentially save American lives, but every miss allowed the enemy to continue their assault on the trapped convoy. Corporal Davies suddenly pointed toward a position on the northern hillside. "Martinez, I've got eyes on what looks like a mortar team setting up approximately 3,100 yards out. If they get that weapon operational, they'll be able to drop rounds directly on Bravo Company's position." Sarah swung her rifle toward the indicated position and quickly located the target through her scope. 3 enemy fighters were indeed setting up what appeared to be a 60mm mortar in a position that would give them a clear field of fire into the valley below. Eliminating this threat was now her highest priority. The mortar team was partially concealed behind a low stone wall, with only occasional glimpses of the fighters visible as they worked to prepare their weapon. Sarah would have to wait for the perfect moment when one of them exposed enough of himself to present a clear target. The opportunity came when one of the enemy fighters stood up to adjust the mortar's elevation. Sarah had already calculated the range and wind conditions, and she squeezed the trigger the moment a clear shot presented itself. The bullet struck the target in the upper torso, and he collapsed immediately. The remaining members of the mortar team immediately abandoned their weapon and sought cover behind the stone wall. Without enough personnel to operate the mortar effectively, the immediate threat to the trapped convoy was eliminated. But Sarah knew that other threats were developing across the battlefield. The sound of helicopters approaching from the south announced the arrival of close air support. 2 attack helicopters appeared over the horizon, flying low and fast toward the combat zone. Their arrival would dramatically change the tactical situation, but Sarah's role in the battle was far from over. All ground units, this is Viper Flight," came the call from the lead helicopter pilot. "We are on station and ready to engage targets of opportunity. Request immediate target designation from Overwatch elements." Staff Sergeant Martinez took over the radio to coordinate with the helicopters, while Sarah continued scanning for targets. The presence of air support would help even the odds, but the extreme range of her position meant she could still engage targets that were beyond the helicopter's immediate reach. As the helicopters began their attack runs on enemy positions, Sarah noticed movement on a distant ridgeline that caught her attention. A small group of enemy fighters was setting up what appeared to be a man-portable air defense system, a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile that could threaten the supporting helicopters. The range to this new target was approximately 3,500 yards, at the very limit of effective range for her rifle and scope combination. The shot would require perfect conditions and flawless execution, but the threat to the helicopters was too significant to ignore. Sarah called out the target to her spotter and began making the complex calculations required for such an extreme shot. Wind speed, temperature, humidity, elevation difference, and bullet drop all had to be factored into her aiming solution. This would be the most challenging shot of her military career, attempted under the most stressful conditions imaginable. As she prepared for what might be the most important shot of the entire battle, Sarah could hear the voices of her doubters echoing in her memory. They had said she couldn't perform under stress. They had said she would crack when lives depended on her skills. They had said women didn't belong in combat roles. Now, with an entire battalion's survival potentially hanging in the balance, Sarah was about to prove them all wrong. The enemy air defense team was working quickly to prepare their missile system, and Sarah knew she had only moments before they would be ready to engage the supporting helicopters. The surface-to-air missile launcher they were setting up could down either aircraft with a single shot, potentially turning the tide of the battle back in favor of the insurgents. Through her rifle scope, Sarah could see 3 enemy fighters working around the missile system. One appeared to be the gunner, preparing to shoulder the launcher, while the other 2 seemed to be acting as security and spotters. The range was an incredible 3,500 yards, over 2 miles of desert air between her position and the target. Corporal Davies was calling out atmospheric conditions while tracking the enemy team through his spotting scope. Range 3,500 yards confirmed. Wind is variable, 8 to 12 miles per hour from the southwest. Temperature is 102 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity is low. Barometric pressure is steady. Sarah made rapid mental calculations for bullet drop and wind drift at such an extreme range. At 3,500 yards, her bullet would drop approximately 85 feet from the line of sight and would be affected significantly by the crosswind. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. Even a small mistake in calculation or execution would result in a complete miss. The psychological pressure was enormous. Sarah could hear radio chatter indicating that one of the helicopters had already taken small arms fire and was maneuvering to avoid additional threats. If the air defense team succeeded in launching their missile, the entire air support element could be lost, leaving the ground forces without crucial fire support. Sarah's breathing exercises kicked in automatically as she settled into her final firing position. She had practiced this level of concentration thousands of times, but never with so much riding on a single shot. The voices of her critics seemed to fade away as she focused entirely on the task at hand. The target through her scope appeared impossibly small at such an extreme range. The enemy gunner was partially concealed behind rocky terrain, with only portions of his body visible as he prepared the missile launcher. Sarah would have to time her shot perfectly, waiting for the moment when enough of the target was exposed to ensure a hit. "Helicopters are beginning their attack run," Davies reported. "Enemy air defense team is tracking them. Looks like they're preparing to engage." Sarah could see the enemy gunner raising the missile launcher to his shoulder, beginning to track one of the approaching helicopters through the weapon's sight system. In moments, he would be ready to fire, and the American aircraft would be in mortal danger. The crosshairs of Sarah's scope settled on the center of the visible target area. She had calculated the holdover for bullet drop and was leading the target appropriately for wind drift. Her breathing was controlled and steady, her heart rate was manageable despite the adrenaline, and her hands were rock steady on the rifle. Sarah's finger took up the slack in the trigger as she prepared for the shot. Everything seemed to slow down around her as her world narrowed to just the view through her scope and the enemy fighter in her crosshairs. This was the moment that all her training had been building toward. The trigger broke cleanly, and Sarah felt the familiar recoil of her rifle as the bullet began its long journey across the desert. At such an extreme range, the bullet's flight time would be approximately 6 seconds, an eternity when measured against the speed of combat. Sarah held her position and tracked the target through her scope, watching for any indication of the bullet's impact. The enemy gunner continued to track the helicopter for what seemed like an endless moment, and Sarah began to fear that her shot had missed its mark. Then, suddenly, the enemy fighter pitched backward and disappeared from view behind the rocky outcropping. The missile launcher tumbled from his hands and clattered down the hillside, rendering the air defense system useless. Sarah's shot had found its target at a range that would have challenged the most experienced military snipers in the world. "Confirmed hit on air defense position," Davies shouted over the radio. "Target down, missile threat eliminated." The effect of Sarah's successful shot was immediately apparent across the battlefield. The helicopters continued their attack runs without threat from surface-to-air missiles, raining devastating fire on enemy positions throughout the valley. The psychological impact on the remaining insurgent fighters was visible even from Sarah's distant position as they began abandoning their positions and retreating toward escape routes in the northern hills. Radio communications from the trapped convoy indicated that the pressure on their position was finally beginning to ease. Alpha Company's flanking attack was succeeding in clearing enemy positions from the southern ridgeline, while Charlie Company was making rapid progress in their direct assault. The combination of ground forces and air support was overwhelming the insurgent ambush. "Bravo 6, this is Alpha 6, came the welcome voice over the radio. "We have reached your position and are beginning casualty evacuation. The immediate threat has been neutralized." Sarah slumped behind her rifle, suddenly feeling the exhaustion that adrenaline had been holding at bay. The precision shooting engagement had lasted over an hour, with constant pressure and the knowledge that lives hung in the balance with every shot. She had engaged 13 different targets, at ranges varying from 2,600 to 3,500 yards, with 11 confirmed hits. Corporal Davies was grinning widely as he lowered his spotting scope. "Martinez, that was the most incredible shooting I've ever witnessed. That final shot at 3,500 yards was absolutely impossible, and you made it look routine." Staff Sergeant Martinez approached Sarah's position with the expression of amazement and respect. "Outstanding work, Martinez. Your precision fire support was the decisive factor in breaking that ambush. Without your intervention, we could have lost an entire company." As the immediate tactical situation stabilized, Sarah began to process what had just happened. She had faced the ultimate test of her skills under the most stressful conditions imaginable, and she had not just succeeded, she had excelled beyond anyone's expectations. The rescue operation continued for several more hours as helicopters evacuated the wounded and recovered damaged vehicles from the valley floor. Sarah's unit remained in their overwatch position, providing security for the evacuation efforts. But the major combat action was over. During a brief lull in activity, Sarah's satellite phone buzzed with an incoming call. To her surprise, it was Lieutenant Colonel Reeves calling from the forward operating base. News of the successful rescue operation had already reached higher command levels, along with reports of Sarah's exceptional performance. "Martinez, I just got off a conference call with division headquarters," Reeves said. "Word of your shooting today has reached all the way back to the Pentagon. Hitting targets at 3,500 yards under combat conditions is something that very few people have ever accomplished." Sarah was still processing the magnitude of what she had achieved when Reeves continued. "I want you to know that you've not only saved American lives today, but you've also shattered every stereotype and preconception about women in combat roles. Your performance today will be studied and remembered for years to come." As evening approached and her unit prepared to return to base, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Months of doubt, criticism, and pressure had led to this single day when everything came together perfectly. She had proven to herself and everyone else that skill, determination, and training mattered more than gender when lives were on the line. The convoy ride back to base was subdued, but proud. Word of the successful rescue operation had spread throughout the forward operating base, and Sarah knew that her reception would be very different from the skepticism she had faced during her early days of deployment. Corporal Davies broke the thoughtful silence in their vehicle. "Martinez, can I ask you something? How did you stay so calm during those shots? I mean, the pressure was incredible, and you never seemed to let it get to you." Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "I think it was because I finally stopped listening to everyone else's doubts and started trusting my own abilities. All the training, all the practice, all the preparation. It was all building toward moments like today. When the shooting started, everything else just fell away, and it was just me, my rifle, and the targets." The truth was more complex than that simple explanation. Sarah had indeed found a zone of calm focus during the engagement, but it had taken months of mental preparation to reach that point. She had learned to channel pressure and stress into heightened concentration, rather than letting them degrade her performance. As they approached the base perimeter, Sarah could see groups of soldiers waiting to welcome the returning convoy. News of the successful rescue had spread throughout the installation, and there was a sense of celebration in the air that had been absent during the tense morning hours. The vehicle convoy pulled through the main gate and stopped near the central headquarters building. As Sarah climbed out of her transport, carrying her rifle and equipment, she was surprised to see a crowd of soldiers from various units gathered in the area. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves was waiting with several other senior officers, including some Sarah didn't recognize. Their presence indicated that word of the day's events had reached much higher levels of command than she had expected. "Martinez, front and center," Reeves called out as Sarah approached the group. "I want to introduce you to some visitors who arrived this afternoon specifically to meet the soldier responsible for today's remarkable shooting performance." Sarah snapped to attention as she was introduced to a colonel from division headquarters and a general from the regional command. Both officers had flown in specifically to debrief the rescue operation and to meet the sniper whose precision fire had been instrumental in its success. "Private First Class Martinez," the general began, "I've been in the Army for 32 years, and I've seen a lot of exceptional soldiers in that time. What you accomplished today ranks among the finest examples of marksmanship and courage under fire that I've ever witnessed." The formal recognition was gratifying, but Sarah found herself more moved by the reaction of her fellow soldiers. Men who had questioned her presence in the unit just hours earlier were now looking at her with expressions of respect and admiration. The doubts and whispers had been silenced by the undeniable evidence of her performance in combat. Private Jenkins, the soldier who had been most vocal in his criticism of women in combat roles, approached Sarah as the formal ceremonies concluded. His expression was a mixture of embarrassment and genuine respect. "Martinez, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I was wrong about you. And I was wrong about women in combat. What you did today saved a lot of lives, including probably mine, if our unit had been called in as reinforcement. I'm sorry for doubting you, and I'm honored to serve alongside you." Sarah accepted the apology graciously, recognizing that Jenkins' change of heart represented something larger than just one soldier's opinion. The successful rescue operation had demonstrated that combat effectiveness had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with skill, training, and determination. As the evening wore on and the initial excitement began to fade, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts, for the first time since the early morning alarm had shattered the pre-dawn quiet. The magnitude of what had happened was still sinking in, and she knew that this day would mark a turning point in her military career and in her own self-perception. The young woman who had struggled with self-doubt during training exercises was gone, replaced by a proven combat veteran who had faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious. The voices of criticism and skepticism that had haunted her for months had been silenced by the undeniable evidence of her performance when it mattered most. But Sarah also knew that this was just the beginning of her story, not the end. The successful rescue operation had established her reputation, but it would be up to her to build on that foundation and continue proving herself worthy of the respect she had earned. 6 months after the rescue operation that had changed everything, Sarah found herself standing before a packed auditorium at the Army's Advanced Marksmanship School. She was now Staff Sergeant Martinez, having been promoted twice in recognition of her exceptional service and her role in developing new long-range shooting techniques for military snipers. The audience consisted of instructors, advanced students, and visiting officers from allied nations who had come to learn about the tactics and techniques that had emerged from Sarah's combat experience. The 3,500-yard shot that had saved the helicopters had become legendary within military circles, studied and analyzed as an example of precision shooting at the absolute limits of human capability. The key to extreme long-range shooting under combat conditions, Sarah explained to the attentive audience, is not just technical skill with the rifle. It's the ability to maintain mental focus and emotional control when everything around you is chaotic and lives are depending on your performance. Sarah had initially been reluctant to take on the instructor role, preferring to remain with her combat unit, but Lieutenant Colonel Reeves, now promoted to colonel, had convinced her that sharing her knowledge could save more lives than any single deployment. The Advanced Marksmanship School had become the military's premier training facility for precision shooting, and Sarah's real-world experience was invaluable in developing realistic training programs. The transformation in how she was perceived had been dramatic and complete. The same military that had questioned whether women belonged in combat roles now held her up as an example of excellence for all soldiers to emulate. Her techniques were being studied and adopted by sniper schools around the world, and her combat record had opened doors that had previously been closed to women in the military. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The self-doubt that had plagued her early career had been replaced by quiet confidence born of proven experience. She knew her capabilities intimately and no longer felt the need to prove herself to skeptics. Her focus had shifted from seeking acceptance to helping others achieve their own potential. After the presentation, Sarah was approached by a young female soldier who reminded her strongly of her younger self. Private Lisa Chen was one of the first women to be accepted into the Advanced Sniper Training Program, a direct result of the policy changes that had followed Sarah's successful deployment. Staff Sergeant Martinez, I wanted to thank you for making this opportunity possible, Chen said nervously. I know that if you hadn't proven that women could excel in this role, I never would have had the chance to try. Sarah smiled, recognizing the mixture of determination and anxiety in the young soldier's expression. Private Chen, the only thing I proved is that skill and determination matter more than anything else. Your success will depend entirely on your own efforts and preparation. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't do something. Let your performance speak for itself. Quote, the conversation with Chen reminded Sarah of her own struggles and the importance of mentorship in developing the next generation of female soldiers. She had started an informal program to support women entering combat roles, sharing not just technical knowledge but also strategies for dealing with skepticism and building confidence. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her sister back home. Saw your interview on the military news channel. Mom cried when they showed the ceremony where you received the Silver Star. Grandpa would be so proud. When are you coming home for leave? The Silver Star had been awarded for Sarah's actions during the rescue operation, recognizing her gallantry in action and the decisive impact of her precision shooting. The medal ceremony had been attended by the soldiers whose lives she had saved, including several members of Bravo Company who had traveled specifically to honor her contribution to their survival. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, now one of Sarah's closest friends and a fellow instructor at the school, joined her after the presentation concluded. Martinez, I just got word from headquarters about the new assignment they want to offer you. They're looking for someone to lead a joint training program with Allied forces, teaching advanced shooting techniques to international partners. The assignment would be a prestigious one, representing the United States Army's commitment to sharing tactical innovations with friendly nations. It would also mark another milestone in Sarah's career, as she would be the first woman to hold such a position in the precision shooting community. What do you think? Rodriguez asked. It would mean a promotion to Sergeant First Class, and probably set you up for officer candidate school if that's something you're interested in pursuing. Sarah considered the offer carefully. The opportunity to work with international partners would be professionally rewarding and would further demonstrate that gender was irrelevant when it came to military expertise. At the same time, she valued her current role in training American soldiers and wasn't sure she was ready to take on such expanded responsibilities. I'll need to think about it, Sarah replied. There are still a lot of students here who could benefit from hands-on instruction, and I don't want to leave before the program is fully established. That evening, Sarah found herself alone on the base's shooting range, working through her nightly practice routine. Even after achieving recognition as one of the military's premier marksmen, she maintained a disciplined training schedule that kept her skills sharp. The muscle memory and mental discipline that had saved lives in combat required constant reinforcement. As she settled behind her rifle for a series of long-range practice shots, Sarah's mind wandered back to the events that had transformed her from a doubted recruit to a respected leader. The journey had been more challenging than anything she could have imagined when she first enlisted, but it had also been more rewarding than her most optimistic dreams. The targets at 1,000 yards seemed almost comically easy now. After proving herself capable of precision shots at more than 3 times that distance under combat conditions, Sarah's shot group was tight and centered, a testament to the countless hours of practice and the unshakable confidence that experience had given her. Her phone rang with a call from Colonel Reeves, who had remained a mentor and advocate throughout her career progression. Sarah, I hope you don't mind the informal call, but I wanted to get your thoughts on the international assignment before you make a final decision. I appreciate the guidance, sir, Sarah replied. I'm honored by the opportunity, but I'm concerned about leaving the domestic training program before it's fully mature. I understand your concern, Reeves said, but I think you're underestimating the impact you could have on a broader scale. The techniques you've developed and the example you've set have implications beyond just American military capability. Sharing that knowledge internationally could save lives in conflicts around the world. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Reeves outlining the strategic importance of the international program and the unique qualifications that made Sarah the ideal candidate to lead it. By the time the call ended, Sarah had a much clearer understanding of the opportunity and its potential impact. Later that night, Sarah video called her family back home for the first time in several weeks. Her parents beamed with pride as they caught up on her recent achievements and discussed her future plans. The contrast with her early deployment period, when every conversation had been filled with worry and uncertainty, was remarkable. Your grandfather's old hunting rifle is still hanging over the fireplace, her father mentioned during the call. Every time I look at it, I think about how proud he would be to see what you've accomplished with the skills he taught you. Sarah smiled, remembering the patient hours her grandfather had spent teaching her to shoot as a child. He had emphasized the importance of discipline, respect for the weapon, and the responsibility that came with marksmanship skills. She often thought about how those early lessons had laid the foundation for everything that followed. I've been thinking about writing a book about my experiences, Sarah told her family. Not just about the shooting and the combat, but about overcoming doubt and proving yourself when people don't believe in your abilities. I think there might be young people who could benefit from hearing that story. Her mother's face lit up with enthusiasm. Sarah, that's a wonderful idea. You've always been a good storyteller, and you certainly have an important story to tell. I think it could help a lot of people, not just soldiers." The idea of writing about her experiences had been growing in Sarah's mind for months. She had received numerous requests for interviews and speaking engagements, and she was constantly approached by young women seeking advice about military careers. A book could reach a much broader audience and potentially inspire people facing their own challenges. The next morning, Sarah made her decision about the international assignment. She would accept the position, but with the understanding that she would return to domestic instruction duties after completing the initial program setup. The compromise would allow her to contribute at a global level, while maintaining her commitment to developing American military capability. The announcement of Sarah's new assignment was met with enthusiasm from her colleagues and students at the Advanced Marksmanship School. Private Chen approached her with a mixture of congratulations and concern about losing her mentor, but Sarah assured her that the program would continue and that other excellent instructors would be available for guidance. Besides, Sarah added with a grin, "I expect you'll be ready to become an instructor yourself by the time I return from the international assignment. The skills you've shown in training suggest that you have the potential to be an even better shot than I am." Chen's face showed surprise and pride at the suggestion. "Do you really think so, Staff Sergeant?" "I know so," Sarah replied confidently. "Talent and determination are gender neutral, and you have both in abundance. The question isn't whether you can succeed. It's how far you'll go once you start believing in yourself." As Sarah prepared for her departure to begin the international training program, she reflected on the unexpected path her career had taken. What had started as a struggle for acceptance had evolved into a mission to open doors for others and to demonstrate that excellence knew no boundaries. The young woman who had trembled during her first qualification shoot had become a leader whose influence extended far beyond the military. Her story had become an inspiration not just for aspiring female soldiers, but for anyone facing doubt and skepticism while pursuing their goals. The precision shot that had saved a battalion had been just the beginning. Sarah's real legacy would be measured not in the targets she had hit, but in the barriers she had broken and the paths she had opened for those who would follow. The doubters had been silenced not by arguments or policies, but by undeniable performance when it mattered most. As she looked toward the future, Sarah knew that challenges lay ahead. Breaking barriers was just the first step. Maintaining progress and continuing to expand opportunities would require ongoing effort and vigilance. But she faced those challenges with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through combat. The knowledge that preparation, skill, and determination could overcome any obstacle. The woman they had said couldn't perform under stress had not only proven them wrong but had set a new standard for what was possible when talent was given the opportunity to flourish. Her 3,500-yard precision shot had saved lives in that desert valley, but her greater achievement was ensuring that future generations of women would never have to face the same doubts and limitations that had once seemed insurmountable. Sarah's story was far from over, but she had already accomplished something that would endure long after her military service ended. She had proven that courage, skill, and determination were not bound by gender, and she had opened a door that could never again be closed. But the most dramatic moment was yet to come, and it would test every skill Sarah had developed during her months of training.